I was the problem in my family. At least, that's how they told the story. Whenever something went wrong, my name was the easiest to say out loud. I learned early that silence kept the peace, and truth shattered it. So I stayed quiet. For years, I let them believe what they needed to believe, because it made their lives easier. Families have a way of choosing one person to carry what no one else wants to face. The guilt, the shame, the lie. I didn't fight it. I didn't defend myself. I just waited. Because some truths don't need to be shouted. They only need time. What happens when the person your family blamed for everything finally stops protecting their version of the story? I learned very early that every family needs a story it can live with. And every story needs a character who explains the cracks. In ours, that character was me. It didn't happen all at once. No one ever sat me down and said, "You'll be the one we blame." Families aren't that honest. It was quieter than that. Softer. Almost polite. The kind of thing you don't notice until it's already settled into your bones. At first, it was small. A look exchanged across the room when I spoke. A sigh when my name came up. A subtle pause before someone answered my questions, as if they were deciding how much truth I could handle. I told myself I was imagining it. That was easier than asking. When my younger brother lost his job, it was because I'd stressed him out by asking for help with our mother. When my sister's marriage began to crack, it was because I brought negativity into the house. When holidays felt tense, someone would eventually say, half joking, "Well, you know how she is," and the room would relax. As if a diagnosis had been made. I became the explanation. I was the one who made things uncomfortable. The one who remembered what others preferred to forget. The one whose absence made gatherings smoother. No one yelled. No one insulted me outright. That would have required confrontation, and confrontation threatened the peace. Instead, they practiced something far more effective: quiet agreement. A shared understanding that if something felt wrong, I was probably nearby. I noticed how often conversations stopped when I entered a room. How laughter resumed only after I left. I noticed that plans were made quickly, efficiently, and somehow without me. When I asked, I was told it was a misunderstanding. When I asked again, I was told I was being sensitive. That word followed me for years. Sensitive. As if sensitivity were a flaw rather than a warning system. There was a family gathering one winter that made everything clear, though I didn't admit it to myself until much later. We were all at my parents' house, crowded around the dining table, plates still half full. Someone brought up a memory from years earlier, a disagreement that had never been resolved. The details were fuzzy, rewritten over time, softened around the edges. Except for one part, my part. As the story was retold, eyes slowly turned toward me. Not accusing, not angry, expectant, waiting for me to play my role. I remember opening my mouth to correct something. Just one detail, one small truth. But before I could speak, my mother placed her hand gently on the table and said, "Let's not start that again." Her voice was calm, almost kind. The message was clear. Peace was more important than accuracy. Comfort mattered more than truth. So I closed my mouth. Something in the room settled after that. I could feel it. The tension eased. Plates clinked again. Someone laughed. The story continued, cleaner now, simpler. And I was once again the reason it existed at all. That was the night I understood what my silence was doing for them. I was absorbing what they didn't want to carry. I was holding the parts of the past that made them uneasy, so they wouldn't have to look too closely at themselves. My quiet acceptance allowed them to believe they were good people in a complicated situation, rather than active participants in a lie. And I let them, because silence has its own rewards. When you don't push back, people relax around you. They invite you just enough to feel generous. They speak about you as if you're fragile, or difficult, or sad, but never dangerous. Never disruptive. I told myself it was temporary. That one day, when the timing was right, the truth would matter. That someone would ask, sincerely, what had really happened. Years passed. No one asked. I aged into the role they'd written for me. The difficult sister. The unreliable daughter. The one whose version of events was always a little off. I noticed how carefully my family avoided asking about my life, my work, my thoughts. It was safer not to know too much. Safer not to complicate the story. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what would happen if I stopped cooperating. If I said, calmly and clearly, that's not how it happened. If I refused to nod along. If I asked them to look directly at what they were protecting. But I already knew the answer. The peace would shatter, and I would be blamed for that too. So I stayed quiet. I built a life that didn't require their approval. Not a dramatic one, not a triumphant one, just a steady, contained existence where my worth didn't need to be argued. I learned how to listen without absorbing, how to be present without being available. I became very good at being neutral. What they never understood was that silence isn't empty. It's heavy. It stores everything that's been denied. Every truth postponed. Every responsibility redirected. And silence, given enough time, changes shape. They thought I was protecting them. In a way, I was. But I was also watching. Learning. Waiting for the moment when silence would no longer serve the same purpose. Because roles can be accepted without being permanent. And stories can be carried without being believed. I didn't know yet how it would end. I only knew this. I wouldn't always be the villain they needed. Have you ever realized too late that staying silent was actually protecting the people who hurt you? Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It gathers in the spaces where conversations should have happened and didn't. In the unanswered questions. In the holidays that felt lighter without me, and the phone calls that became shorter, then rare, then unnecessary. After a while, my family learned how to live without explaining themselves to me. And I learned how to live without waiting for them to. The first few years were the hardest. Not because I missed them constantly, but because I kept expecting something, an apology, a clarification, a moment of honesty, to appear suddenly, as if time alone might produce it. I imagined that distance would create perspective. That absence would make them curious. It didn't. Distance made everything easier for them. Without me nearby, there was no one to quietly contradict the story they told themselves. No one to remember details that complicated their version of events. I existed only as an idea now, simplified, contained, manageable. When my name came up, it was usually followed by a sigh. She's always been that way. She likes to see things differently. She holds onto things, as if memory were a flaw. I stopped trying to correct it. Correcting required energy, and I was learning how much energy I'd spent my entire life bracing for misunderstanding. Silence, once practiced, becomes efficient. It conserves strength. It creates room. I filled that room slowly. I found work that asked nothing from my family and offered no explanations in return. I learned the pleasure of routine, coffee at the same hour, walks taken without urgency, evenings that ended exactly when I wanted them to. I chose friendships that didn't require me to perform a role. People who listened without immediately translating my words into something more convenient. For the first time, my thoughts didn't feel dangerous. Still, the past followed me quietly. Not as pain, exactly, but as pressure. The awareness that something unfinished existed behind me. That a version of me still lived inside my family's story, frozen and misrepresented, carrying weight that wasn't mine alone. Occasionally, there were messages. Brief, polite, carefully neutral. An update about a birthday. A notice about a change in address. Always informational, never emotional. As if we were distant relatives rather than people bound by history. I replied just enough to remain human. What surprised me most was how my absence changed me more than it changed them. Without constant exposure to their expectations, I began to hear my own reactions more clearly. I noticed how quickly I apologized out of habit. How often I softened statements before anyone challenged them. How instinctively I prepared defenses that were no longer needed. Those habits took years to unlearn. I also noticed something else, something quieter, but far more unsettling. I wasn't angry, not in the way I'd expected to be. Anger requires engagement, and I had disengaged long ago. What I felt instead was a deep, steady clarity. I could see, with unsettling precision, how the role had been constructed. How each of them had benefited from it. My brother's mistakes appeared smaller when contrasted against my supposed instability. My sister's choices seemed wiser by comparison. My parents' compromises felt justified because they were, after all, dealing with me. It was never about what I did. It was about what my existence allowed them to avoid. Years passed, quietly, almost peacefully. Then our father's health began to fail. The message came the same way all family news did now, indirectly, cautiously, as if the information itself might provoke something. A short email, a careful tone, no request, no invitation. Just facts, delivered without expectation. I read it twice before closing my laptop. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't need to. Illness has a way of reordering priorities, but it also exposes patterns. I knew how this would go. Concern would be shared selectively. Decisions would be made efficiently. Roles would be reassigned, but only temporarily. I was asked, eventually, to help. Not because they trusted me, but because I was available. Useful. Familiar with inconvenience. I agreed, without enthusiasm or resistance. Returning felt strange, not painful. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The furniture unchanged. The air heavy with the same unspoken agreements. They greeted me politely, warmly even, as if we were resuming a conversation paused only briefly, rather than decades ago. No one mentioned the past. I noticed how carefully they watched me, waiting for tension, for drama, for proof that the old narrative still applied. When none appeared, they relaxed. The peace held. I did what was needed. I listened. I coordinated appointments. I stayed out of the way. And all the while, something subtle shifted. Because silence, when it's chosen rather than imposed, feels different. It carries intention. It waits. They mistook my calm for compliance. My restraint for agreement. They believed the years had softened me into something harmless. They didn't realize that silence, given enough time, becomes a record. And records have a way of resurfacing. I wasn't there to reclaim anything. I wasn't there to correct the past. I was there because something unfinished had finally begun to move. And I could feel it. What changes when the person your family blamed returns, not to argue, but to observe? Truth doesn't announce itself. It waits for circumstances to loosen the grip of denial. Our father's illness progressed slowly, then all at once. The kind of decline that stretches time until everyone is exhausted enough to stop pretending. Hospital rooms have a way of stripping people down. Conversations shorten, masks slip, long-held assumptions begin to feel heavier than necessary. I spent many hours sitting quietly near the window of his room, watching light move across the floor. My family moved around me carefully, as if I were a piece of furniture that had always been there but never fully trusted. I listened more than I spoke. That was still my role. Observation came naturally now. One evening, after the others had left, my father asked me to stay. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. Unsettlingly so. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking, as if measuring something internal. Something unresolved. "You've been carrying a lot," he said finally. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was a statement. And it landed with more weight than anything I'd heard in years. I didn't respond right away. Silence had taught me patience. He continued, slowly, carefully. He spoke about the past in fragments, never naming specific events, never assigning responsibility directly. He talked about choices made for the sake of stability. About fear disguised as practicality. About how families sometimes decide who will absorb the cost of peace. He didn't say my name when he spoke about blame. He didn't have to. What mattered was this: he acknowledged that the story wasn't complete. That something had been simplified, redirected, allowed to settle into place because it was convenient. That was all he gave me. And that was all I needed. A few days later, after a long night and a quiet morning, my father passed away. Grief moved through the family quickly, efficiently. Plans were made. Calls were placed. Details handled with practiced coordination. I watched the process unfold with a strange calm. Loss didn't surprise me. What followed did. The will was read the following week. We gathered in a small office, the air too clean, the chairs arranged with unnecessary precision. The lawyer spoke in a measured tone, outlining assets, decisions, and tensions. Then he paused. There was an addendum, a letter. It wasn't long, but it was specific. My father had written it himself. Recently, in careful handwriting that suggested effort, deliberation, choice. He wrote about responsibility, about how truth, when delayed, doesn't disappear, it transfers. He wrote about one decision made years earlier that had been allowed to define the wrong person. About how silence had been mistaken for agreement. And then he named me. Not as a victim, not as a hero, but as the one who had carried what wasn't hers to hold. The room changed. I felt it before anyone spoke. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, like air pressure adjusting. My siblings avoided looking at me. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued, but the damage, or the correction, was already done. No accusations were made. No details exposed. The letter didn't rewrite the past entirely. It simply disrupted the version everyone had relied on. For the first time, the story wobbled. Afterward, there was no confrontation. That surprised them. They waited for it. I could see it in their posture, their caution. They expected questions, explanations, emotion. I offered none. That unsettled them more than anger ever could have. In the days that followed, small truths surfaced organically. A memory someone corrected mid-sentence. A hesitation before repeating an old narrative. A question asked too late. And left unanswered. The past began to reassemble itself quietly, without my involvement. My family tried, in their own way, to include me more. Invitations extended with visible effort. Conversations adjusted slightly in my presence. As if proximity alone might restore balance. But something fundamental had shifted. I no longer needed their recognition. And they could feel it. One afternoon, my sister asked if we could talk. Her voice was careful, rehearsed. She spoke about misunderstanding, about perspective, about how things had felt different from where she stood. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she waited. I told her the truth, not the past, but the present. I told her I didn't need agreement anymore. That I wasn't interested in repairing the story. That some roles, once recognized, lose their power. She nodded, uncertain. She wanted resolution. I offered clarity. That was the difference. The truth didn't reunite us. It didn't fracture us either. It simply removed the illusion that had kept everything neatly arranged. Without a villain to anchor it, the family dynamic felt unsteady. Honest. Incomplete. And that was no longer my responsibility. I realized then that truth isn't something you unleash. It's something you stop preventing. Once released, it moves on its own schedule. It rearranges things without asking permission. I hadn't reclaimed my place in the family. I had stepped out of the story entirely. And for the first time, that felt like peace. After the truth surfaced, my family expected something from me. Not an apology that would have required them to accept fault. Not forgiveness that would have been too generous. What they expected, without ever saying it aloud, was closure. A neat emotional conclusion that would allow everything to settle back into place. They wanted reassurance that we could move on without discomfort. I didn't give it to them. In the weeks following my father's death, I noticed how often my phone buzzed with tentative messages. Invitations phrased carefully, questions padded with politeness. Each one carried the same unspoken hope, that I would step forward and help them decide what came next. I had spent years carrying the weight of their peace. I wasn't interested in redesigning it. Dignity, I was learning, is quiet. It doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. It shows up in what you no longer explain, what you refuse to negotiate, what you allow to remain unfinished. I visited my mother one final time before leaving town. The house felt hollow now, stripped of urgency. She moved through it slowly, as if relearning its shape. We sat at the kitchen table where so many conversations had ended before they began. She spoke first. "I wish things had been different," she said. It was the closest she could come to acknowledging the truth. I recognized the effort it took for her to say even that much. Years ago, I might have reached for it, tried to build something from the fragments. Now, I simply nodded. "I do too," I replied. What I didn't say was that different doesn't always mean closer. Sometimes it means clearer. She looked at me then, really looked. Perhaps for the first time without the filter of expectation. I wondered what she saw. Not the role, not the label, just a woman who had outgrown the need to be understood. When I stood to leave, she hesitated, then asked if I would visit more often. I told her I would see how things felt. That was the truth. It was enough. Leaving town felt lighter than arriving had. Not because the past was resolved, but because it was no longer chasing me. I drove without urgency, windows down, the quiet stretching comfortably around me. I thought about how easily families confuse endurance with obligation, how they mistake tolerance for loyalty, how often they rely on the most reasonable person in the room to absorb what no one else wants to confront. I had been that person. Not anymore. In the months that followed, life settled into something steady and honest. I kept my routines. I maintained contact on my terms. When old patterns tried to reassert themselves, I noticed and stepped back. No speeches, no ultimatums, just boundaries, clearly held. Occasionally, someone would reference the past in passing, testing the ground. I didn't correct them. I didn't confirm them either. I let the silence stand, not as protection, but as choice. There is a difference between silence that hides and silence that ends a conversation. I chose the latter. I understood now that being cast as the villain had never been about me. It had been about fear. Fear of disruption. Fear of accountability. Fear of seeing themselves clearly. That fear was no longer mine to manage. The most surprising thing was how little drama followed my withdrawal. No explosions. No confrontations. Just a gradual adjustment, like a system learning to function without a familiar but faulty part. They found new explanations. New dynamics. New ways to distribute discomfort. I wished them well. Dignity isn't about winning. It isn't about being proven right in the eyes of those who misunderstood you. It's about knowing when participation costs more than it gives. For years, I had believed endurance was strength. I had believed patience would be rewarded. I had believed that if I stayed calm long enough, someone would eventually ask the right questions. They didn't. And that realization didn't break me. It freed me. I stopped waiting for the story to change. I stopped hoping to be rewritten. I allowed myself to exist outside of it entirely. The role I was given no longer fit. And I didn't owe anyone a replacement. Sometimes, late in the evening, I think about the younger version of myself, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace. I don't judge her. She did what she could with what she knew. She survived. But survival isn't the same as living. Living requires choice. I chose dignity. And in doing so, I discovered something I hadn't expected at all. Not triumph, not closure, not reconciliation. Just peace. Some families never apologize. Not because they don't know the truth, but because knowing it would change who they believe they are. I didn't wait for understanding. I didn't demand remorse. I chose something quieter. I chose to stop carrying what was never mine. And in that silence, not the kind that hides, but the kind that ends, I found peace. Not the peace of reconciliation, but the peace of finally walking away whole. If your family needed a villain to keep their peace, would you stay silent, or would you choose yourself? If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and stay connected. More quiet, psychological stories about family, dignity, and unspoken truths are coming soon. Your presence here matters more than you know.